Going. Okay. Great. So we'll just give it a moment because when we turn on the broadcast, it takes a moment to weave in everybody who's in the queue, who's observing our meeting today. So we'll just give it a moment. Hang on one sec, folks, and we'll get going here. I'm happy to actually share a screen here for a second. So welcome, folks. As you're coming in, we'll get going in 1 second. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, so welcome everybody. This is a meeting of the Advisory Committee of the Maine Offshore Wind Roadmap. Thanks for joining us in our 1-hour check-in meeting today. I'll turn it over to your co-chairs in just 1 second. Just a reminder, we're on Zoom. This is a Zoom webinar, so you'll see on the screen today members of the Advisory Committee and staff and some guests that are presenting today. And thanks to everybody else who's joining us on this webinar. We appreciate you being with us today. We will point you to the Maine Offshore Wind website, which is a great Maine Offshore Wind Initiative website, which is a great place to channel comments and be in touch with us. So with that, I'll turn it over to your co-chairs, Dan Burgess, Director of the Governor's Energy Office, and Admiral Gregory Johnson. Dan, would you like to kick it off?
Yeah, sure. Good morning, everyone. Great to see everyone on Zoom for this 1-hour check-in meeting. We've done this previously, and I think it was a really useful opportunity to hear from folks and keep the momentum going and keep the advisory committee and those listening up to speed on the really significant progress of the roadmap. I think since we've last met, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and the Department of Interior has put out a timeline for identifying wind energy areas in the Gulf of Maine and then lease sales by 2024. Since then, the governor has sent a letter to the Department of Interior, to the Secretary, outlining desire to have a task force meeting to look at that, and then also make sure that there's engagement with folks in this roadmap process, and especially the fishing industry, and happy to provide that to folks. It is on the Energy Office's webpage. But we're looking at what that could mean or kind of the process for how that will move forward. But I want to make sure everyone was aware of it. And from my perspective, just the work that's happening at the working group level is just going to be incredibly important to informing, kind of Maine strategy and both the kind of near term and the long term. So I'm excited to hear the updates today and to hear from ISO New England. And I will leave it at that and turn it over to Grog if he has any opening remarks.
Thank you, Dan, and I certainly share your comments. Appreciate the hard work of the working groups and Stephanie's periodic updates to keep us apprised of what they're doing. That's, of course, as we know, where the real hard work is going on. It's been a particularly dynamic and active time, as Dan noted, over the past month, with the positive pronouncements from the administration, the passage of the infrastructure bill, and the realities of serious money being put towards renewable energy. And of course, we did submit our research array application, and we hope to hear about that soon. Also, of course, the referendum here in Maine and what kind of impacts that might have on the way the renewable energy community thinks about doing business in our state, and what kind of impacts that could possibly have on the outcome of our effort here. There's activity going on in lots of states in the New England area, which are, it's integral to what we do, particularly Massachusetts and the amount of money that they're putting towards this effort, which will have impacts on us. And I'm particularly looking forward to the ISO New England presentation that we're going to have later today after the updates from the working groups. And finally, I would say that the kinds of issues that, as we are informed by what happens with from the reports from the working groups today, to make sure that we tee up the 14 December meeting in such a manner that we really nail down all of the important issues that we need to make sure that we've examined as we begin to get to the stage of our process where we're starting to come to some kind of conclusions and recommendations and trying to take pen to paper and articulate them in a manner that'll, again, enable a good way forward for offshore wind energy in the state of Maine. That would be my remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Grog. Thanks, Dan. That's really helpful. So as Dan, and Grog mentioned, we're doing two things today in this hour. I'll just quickly show an agenda. It's very straightforward. We're going to do a round of sort of lightning updates from the working groups. We've asked the co-chairs to speak for 3 or 4 minutes about what's going on, and then we'll do those all together and then have some discussion on the back end. But we're going to leave the second half hour for a presentation on ISO New England and the relevance for our work. And so we're very grateful to have Kate Bashford Epson here with us today. We'll spend the last 5 minutes just talking, as Grog said, about that outlook for December 14th, where we'll start to share some initial recommendations from the working groups with you all as the advisory committee. So that's what we're doing. And I think we should just jump right into it, unless there's anything folks want to shout out before we jump into our round of working group updates. Everybody good? Okay, great. Good. So I don't have a particular order here, but I'm just looking all around my screen. And so maybe I'll start with the Fisheries working group. Remember, we have our 4 working groups. And we've got both co-chairs, although one co-chair is driving to pick up an engine. So Meredith Mendelson will be giving us an update from the Fisheries working group. So Meredith, let me turn it over to you to give us a sense of what's going on in your conversations in that working group.
Hi.
Hey, Meredith. Seems like there's a bit of a delay in the line with you.
Sorry, I'm having a audio, so I'm sorry about that. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Great.
Okay. So thanks. The Fisheries Working Group met once since our October meeting. We're meeting again tomorrow evening, and then we'll be meeting again the first week of December. At our last meeting, we've reviewed. Go to somebody else and I'll switch.
Okay, that's fine.
I'll switch computers.
Switch computers. Okay, yeah, no worries. Well, why don't we go over to the supply chain, workforce development, ports, and infrastructure group. And there, I think, Jonathan Poole, if you want to start us off, and then if you want to ask your co-chairs to supplement, but would you mind starting us off with what's going on in that group?
Of course. Good morning, everybody. The supply chain, ports, workforce, I guess catch-all group is working on a lot of different initiatives, and we've met a couple times since our last advisory committee meeting. We kind of focused at first on baselining, since we have about a third of our group has limited experience with maritime operations. So we did spend some time getting the group baseline and caught up to maritime operations in terms of, we brought in a guest lecturer, actually a member of our working group provided a guest lecture on the Jones Act and its potential implications on the offshore wind industry within the United States. We talked about the different vessels that are playing a role in offshore wind, not only in Europe, but also kind of the early developments of United States specific offshore wind support vessels that are being developed to the south of us on more fixed bottom initiatives wouldn't necessarily play a role on floating. Those are mostly the vessels that we'd see over in Europe. And then on our last meeting was perhaps one of the most productive meetings we had so far. We took a look at a list of assumptions that we've made as a working group to say these are the assumptions under which we will be operating moving forward. And so we spend a lot of time making sure that we have our assumptions at least grounded in reality. And then following that, we took a first swing at some initial recommendations. And again, this is very early, not ready to share it broadly and widely with the advisory committee yet, but I think that we are working our way through that, at least in the supply chain and the workforce part. And once I wrap up my summary, I'll kick it over to Matt for just a brief update on where the ports working group, or not working group, but study goes. We've met weekly with our consultants that we've brought in to assist the project. They're making significant progress in inventorying businesses, and at least on the supply chain side, main businesses, main infrastructure that can play a role in this industry. And then on the workforce side, looking at the key jobs that will be part of this industry, and quick wins, and then long-term development strategies to ensure that this is an inclusive economic development effort moving forward. And then some cross-cutting issues, I think, just some things that we continually hit on and discuss through every meeting and every consideration is, of course, transmission. Transmission is going to play a role in the development of any offshore winds within the Gulf of Maine. Transmission to markets is certainly going to be a priority. So any supply chain considerations and ports considerations for development within the Gulf of Maine is going to have to rely on transmission. And then the next is balance with fisheries, recognizing that the Maine has a very healthy fishery. So ensuring that we're listening and including dialogue with the fisheries working group, and making those considerations. And at this point, I'll kick it over to Matt if he's willing to give a very brief update on where the ports study stands.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. A short update. It looks like on Friday, we'll be looking to share some of the high-level results of the Moffitt and Nichols study. So we'll be talking a little bit about ports and some of the work that the DOT's been doing over the last year on studying that and the infrastructure needed for offshore wind in the state of Maine. So mostly targeting the Port of Searsport. We'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we have in our second phase of the study, which looks further in the state at port potential and facilities that might be required for as Maine matures with the offshore wind industry. So we're looking forward to sharing some of that with everybody, kind of getting some initial thoughts and reactions, and it should be good.
Great. Okay. Super. Anything else from you all? Is that good? Okay. Great. So that's supply chain, workforce development, ports, and marine transportation. And Jonathan mentioned some cross-cutting things. And one of those is with the energy group and thinking around transmission and also thinking around procurement and things like that. So I don't know, Selena, if you want to take a lead, or Jeremy, in talking about what's going on in the energy strategy and markets group, and where you're at in your process.
Sure. So ironically, when you say transmission and procurement, those are absolutely areas that we will be delving into there. In terms of the technical studies, areas that we're kind of in the next phase of our focus. So the areas so what we've been doing so far is working through the first of the 3 technical studies with our consultants, but also continuing the conversation about how to think about recommendations. And we're not quite to the point of writing and shaping them, but just focusing on what areas we think are going to be the areas of most interest. And just to recap, in terms of the technical studies, where we are at is we will soon have a draft for review of the state of the offshore wind industry and projections for what the industry will look like out to 2050, including technology options, cost projections, and opportunities for Maine from an R&D and innovations side in terms of how we could serve as a hub in that. So that product is in draft form, but moving along pretty well. In addition to that, we are working through the energy needs assessment and modeling and having additional conversations around that, hoping to have a draft of the energy needs out to 2050 from looking at both Maine and the region in the next several weeks, which we know will inform the work of at least the supply chain and other working groups. So we want to make sure that we get that product right, and we'll be able to have that, share that at the next advisory committee meeting, I anticipate. And then the third study that we are moving pretty quickly through is the socioeconomic analysis. And there is a component of quantitative work there and also qualitative. There are part of that includes a number of interviews across different sectors of the Maine economy to understand how we should think about the impacts and opportunities of offshore wind. So we've drafted some interview questions and lists of people to interview that we are sharing with the working group chairs from the Fisheries working group, and others are interested in taking a look. We're happy to share that too, but want to make sure that we get those questions right and that we get the folks to interview, knowing that we want to have a good list of people to talk to help inform the socioeconomic analysis that will be part of this roadmap process. So all of those three pieces, in addition to that, we have a procurement study and a transmission study that are undergoing some work, but we haven't quite delved into those. And what we've been focusing really on is what is the level of what would it take to meaningfully demonstrate the level of commitment necessary to drive investment into Maine? What level of offshore wind do we pursue, and how do we pursue it? And so we've been thinking about that in a number of different ways, both in terms of the amount of offshore wind, but also what it would look like here in the region. And then I think an area where we are focusing to is on regional collaboration and recognizing that we need to work together where appropriate, and identifying those areas as something that our working group has been thinking through. So in terms of deliverables, we may have some initial thoughts in December to share with the working group, may not be fully supported by the technical studies. So we'll see what comes up in the next 2 months and hope to have more in January for the full working group or advisory committee to consider. Jeremy, what else would you add, or what did I miss?
I think you hit upon it. The only thing I would add is we're trying to be a very deliberative group, which is both good and bad at times. And so I view my role as trying to help us avoid analysis paralysis. So we've got a lot of studies, a lot of work, but we also have some key deadlines that we need to meet. So I think Selena's done a fantastic job helping to make sure all the trains are leaving the station on time, but we've got a lot of work ahead of us.
I would just note with Jeremy and Tom Welch on the working group, actionable is, I think, the theme of anytime we talk about recommendations for our working group.
Right. Great. And Selena, and also one of the things that is part of those deliverables you're talking about are these different scenarios that are being developed, like potential scenarios for offshore wind in Maine. That's correct, right?
Yes, and those are and getting there in terms of draft. We in the next week or a couple of weeks, we should have a initial draft out of those for the working group to take a look at. So hoping to progress on that soon.
Great. Okay. Thanks so much. I'm happy to go to Meredith if you want to, or if you want to push one more as you
I'm
wish.
ready.
Okay.
I'm ready. Sorry about that.
No worries.
So I'll just repeat myself, hopefully quickly. The Fisheries Working Group did meet in October. We're meeting again tomorrow evening and then early in December. At our last meeting, we spent much of our time reviewing some of our draft recommendations as they were standing at the time. We also broke out into smaller groups to focus on development of some new draft recommendations. specifically thinking about the categories of siting and communications with the fishing industry. So we're kind of continuing on the work of draft recommendation development for tomorrow's meeting. We're going to be joined by staff from the NOAA Fisheries Northeast Fisheries Science Center and the Greater Atlantic Regional Office, as well as staff from the New England Fishery Management Council. These are individuals who've been deeply involved in thinking about how offshore wind will impact fisheries from both a resource, a habitat, as well as operational perspectives. They've also done a lot of work to identify data gaps and think about how we monitor for change and assess impact if traditional survey methods won't be feasible inside wind farms. So, and then for December, we have a pretty ambitious agenda already that I haven't quite figured out how we're going to sort out. But we do plan to address some questions from working group members about how the outcomes of this work will be used and how our process may evolve given the Biden administration's recent announcement about the Gulf of Maine. We're also hoping perhaps to bring in guests from state government and the fishing industry in the New York Bight area so we can learn from their experiences and their recent procurement strategies. And we'll be continuing discussion of other draft recommendations building out from both the November and December meetings. The group has been developing draft recommendations about a range of different topics and revising them over the course of a few meetings. I would anticipate these would be ready to be shared at a January meeting, but I feel that we're perhaps not quite ready for a December meeting. And I think we're going to need January to start to pull some of those threads together. But in terms of what has been discussed, to give you a quick sneak peek, perhaps the most well fleshed out area that we've been discussing is around monitoring requirements before, during, and after construction, baseline surveys for marine fish species and marine mammals inside and outside the farm, as well as along a cable corridor. The group is also thinking about recommendations related to how survey work should be conducted, including how to collaborate with the fishing industry, using existing survey protocols or calibrating for consistency across the region. And an important note that has underlined a few of our recommendations is the need to make this data available to the public in both raw and synthesized forms. And just want to mention as a side note that the group has also developed some recommendations around monitoring that are specific to the state's proposal for a research array, and that really stand independently of recommendations for this group and for the roadmap, but really informed the development of our thinking for the roadmap as well. We've also been working on recommendations related to how the state can encourage both BOEM and offshore wind developers to communicate with the fishing industry during all phases of project construction. Again, data sharing in publicly accessible formats, best practices for using that data to inform siting, and how the state can encourage and support meaningful engagement with the industry throughout the leasing process and project development. While I haven't been able to personally participate in the other wildlife groups, there's definitely substantial overlap with the environment and wildlife working groups conversations. I think my sense is specifically around the need to identify priority habitats for protection and also assess impacts on endangered species. And I would also note that the regional framework that Selena mentioned is something the Fisheries Working Group is thinking about quite a bit. How do we, leverage resources across the region, implement lessons learned across the region, and understand the needs and strategies of other states and how that's going to influence what happens in the Gulf.
That's really great. Thanks, Meredith. Very helpful update. In speaking of that overlap, why don't I turn over to John Perry from the Environmental Wildlife Working Group to give us an update what's going on there, because there are some parallel conversations, and I know co-chairs, you all have been communicating around that. So John, go ahead, please.
Oh, thanks, Dave. You're absolutely right. As Meredith mentioned, there has been a considerable amount of overlap between our working group and the Fisheries Working Group, and that's really just to ensure that any important considerations are not being overlooked. We continue to benefit from having both Carl Wilson and Aaron Summers from DMR being a strong presence in both groups, and so we really appreciate the expertise that they bring. So with that, our working group has put to paper our phase 1 draft recommendations with the emphasis on draft, but we would like to share them with you. But I do want to take a quick moment to acknowledge my co-chair, Wynn Goodale, who took the concepts of the working group's thoughts and crafted the backbone of these draft recommendations. He had them reviewed by his staff at BRI and also had input from both DMR and Department of Fisheries and Wildlife. And that was just prior to presenting to the working group. So we're still, like I said, it's draft. We're still working on the ordering of our recommendations, but working group members have been making suggested edits since we first rolled these out since last Wednesday. But as drafted, our first recommendation is the use of federal consistency. And essentially what that is for the state to investigate the potential benefits, as well as the process by which it can use its federal consistency review authority under the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act to address issues of concern regarding offshore wind energy development in the Gulf of Maine. And then the group's second recommendation is a mapping exercise of available existing data for the Gulf of Maine. And specifically, in its draft form, we are recommending a spatial planning exercise be conducted soon, or really as early as in early 2022, that will identify areas of greatest conflict between offshore wind development and wildlife concerns in the Gulf. And to support this important recommendation, we've drafted some steps that feed into the process. And we envision these steps will include combining relevant existing data layers into GIS, and then holding workshops with Gulf of Maine science experts, including fishermen. We really value their expertise, and so that all the collective expertise is at the table. And we plan on this being an iterative process, and that the maps will be updated regularly based on feedback and as new data becomes available. And our initial recommendations to feed into this mapping exercise include, again, in no particular order, it's still draft, but the first one is to avoid important foraging habitat for marine birds for those species that have the greatest potential risk from offshore wind. The second is buffering and avoiding these areas between coastal islands where important migratory pathways often occur. And along with that, siting offshore wind projects as far from the coast of Maine as possible, including the coastal islands. And this would minimize exposure to species such as the millions of songbirds that visit our state annually, as well as our rare species of bats. Fourthly, we're looking to avoid areas used by federally listed endangered species. And these species include species such as roseate tern, piping plover, red knot, the North Atlantic right whale, leatherback sea turtles, and both species of sturgeon, Atlantic and short nose. And now, obviously, for some of these species, like the right whale, we recognize that the entire Gulf of Maine is designated as critical habitat necessary for the recovery of these species. But that said, we also recognize that not all critical habitat is created equally, and that some areas of the Gulf are probably less critical than other areas. And our goal is to focus on those areas. Fifthly, we are looking to avoid areas that support and the transport and aggregation of Calanus copepods, specifically the Gulf coastal current, the Maine coastal current. And along with that, we'll be looking to avoid establishing offshore wind areas in locations with high productivity, deep ocean bases, areas with deep sea corals, things like that. And finally, we're looking to avoid known spawning and feeding aggregations of high priority managed species. So that's just a quick overview. Wing, I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add to that.
Thanks, John. I think you covered it really well. And I guess the one thing I would add is that obviously you start thinking down through that list, that feels like a lot. And that, you know, in some senses, you could start to make the entire Gulf of Maine areas of conflict. And what we're really focusing on too in our conversation is how to really prioritize, and also considerations on how you bring these different layers together, potentially way different layers, so that you identify areas that collectively are going to have the greatest conflict. So this point of how to prioritize is going to be sort of the next step in the conversation.
Right. Okay. Thanks, John. Thanks, Wing. So it's really exciting to see actual recommendations start to get on paper. We're seeing it across basically all of the working groups right now. As Meredith mentioned, some working groups are probably going to need some more time before they make any kind of presentation to you all. So we'll be spreading this out from our December 14th meeting into our late January meeting to actually take a look at all these recommendations. Okay, we didn't really, That went a little longer than I thought. Grog, you've got a question. Go ahead, please. Hang on one second. You're still on mute, Grog.
Yeah, I'm a slow learner. First of all, I just want to commend all 4 working groups for the seriousness of their efforts and what they've accomplished to date. And I think they're really getting their arms around the key critical issues. And I just like to foot stomp the comment that Selena made during her presentation about trying to make sure that all of our recommendations are actionable. And that's critically important. I have a few other things I'd like to comment on, but I'll just send you all an email afterwards instead of taking up time, because we got to stick to our timeline today.
Thanks, Grog. And I think that's great advice for everyone. If you have a reaction to what you just heard, the chat is a great place to do it, and directly reaching out to co-chairs is another great way to do it. So we welcome reactions like right now in real time in the chat, if you have just what you've heard just now from the co-chairs. And we also encourage you to reach out directly as advisory committee members to the co-chairs and talk through some of the questions or concerns you have. Okay. So with that, I think we should head into our presentation on ISO New England that folks are eager to hear. I am happy to introduce Kate Bashford-Epson from ISO New England, who has focus on external affairs. And Kate, I'll let you introduce yourself more accurately than I can do right now. But we're extremely pleased that you've agreed to walk us through some of the key challenges associated with what this group is going to be working on and what that means from an ISO New England standpoint. And so, Kate, I'll turn it over to you and I'll pull up your slides while I do that. But thanks so much for joining us, Kate, and welcome.
All right. Thank you, David. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, you're great.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, thanks everyone for having me. It's really nice to be here. As David said, I'm in the external affairs team at ISO New England. And so I particularly cover Maine and New Hampshire. So I'm always here for anyone as a resource when it comes to ISO New England topics. Generally, we're a very technical organization, and I am more of a policy person with a policy background. So just to caveat my presentation today, I'm going to do the best I can to give you an overview kind of ISO New England and how it relates to your work. And feel free to ask me questions as I go. And if any of your questions get technical beyond my knowledge, since I'm not an engineer by training, then I always am happy to take these back. We have lots of great people that are working on this that are my colleagues, and then I can come back to you with more specific answers if there's anything I can't address today. So yeah, next slide, please.
Oh, hang on. Just give me a sec here. If you want to just keep, there we go.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
So I think, a lot of you are somewhat familiar with ISO New England, but I didn't know the makeup of the entire audience. So just to kind of brief refresher, where ISO New England is kind of a unique entity. We're not for profit, and we're regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And so we have three main responsibilities. So we operate the grid for New England on that minute-to-minute basis, meaning, dispatching of power generators, running the high power transmission system. But we don't own any of that. We are just the operator of that system. We really don't own any assets at all other than the building, and the equipment that we use to manage the power system for New England. We also run those electricity markets. So the buying and selling of electricity on the day ahead market and on the real time market, we administer that. So there's a lot of money changing hands. And then thirdly, we plan the power system. So this sometimes I feel like gets a bit less attention because the markets can get I wouldn't say controversial, that might be too hyperbolic, but the markets can get interesting in terms of how they're designed. You know, the grid we kind of understand because it's tangible that it needs to be operated, but we really look at the system that we have, and we look 10 years out, we look, you know, shorter timeframes out, and we say, how are things changing? How is the load changing? What areas are growing? What areas might be using less over time, and how are we going to make sure that we ensure reliability going forward in our system from year to year. So next slide. So here's a very miniature snapshot of that bulk power system that the ISO operates. And you know, a good way to think about it is the interstate highway system. So we operate the higher voltage system, the 345 kV down to about 115. Sometimes it's also a 69 kV line, but generally it's within that bandwidth. And so it's not that distribution system that you see poles and wires, you know, going directly into a building. That's operated by your local utilities. We have a lot of interconnections with neighboring regions and Canada, probably as you all well know, being in Maine. So we have connections to New Brunswick, as you can see there. We have connections into Quebec. So you can also see that there's a good portion of northern Maine that is not under the jurisdiction of ISO New England. That's operated by the Northern Maine Independent System Administrator and MISA. So we don't cover all of New England in its entirety. And let's go to the next slide here. Okay, so let's get into offshore wind specifically a bit more now. So when you look at this slide, what you see on the left is our interconnection queue. So that's every type of resource that says we want to build and we want to interconnect into the existing system. And the ISO studies each of those projects to make sure that it won't adversely impact the existing system. So you're seeing that there's about 30,000 megawatts in that queue looking to be studied. Not all of them will get interconnected, but as a baseline of relative magnitude, the entire system that we have today in New England has about 30,000 megawatts of resources that we use to meet our demand. So that, you know, if all of these interconnected, that would about double our system. But like I said, you know, historically, we've seen maybe about a third of projects in the queue actually come into operation, but that's just because that's historical doesn't mean that a third of this particular queue will also reach operation. So clearly this purple section, which is wind, is the vast majority of the resources looking to interconnect. And then you can see on the right, we show a breakdown of how those wind proposals are designated from each state. And so a lot of it is coming from offshore wind in southern New England. You see that Massachusetts, for example, has 13,000 megawatts in the interconnection queue. You know, Connecticut has 5,600. Maine is still more onshore wind heavy in the interconnection queue. You can see they're 4 megawatts, and that's as of September. So that may have changed very recently. But 4 megawatts are offshore wind resources in that queue. Now, you all likely know why that is. You know, a lot of the Gulf of Maine is deep water, and so I know you're looking to do floating offshore wind rather than, you know, grounded to the seabed floor. And so the process, I think, for development is just much further out, especially with the BOEM task force, you know, with New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and then the BOEM, you know, designating BOEM lease areas. You know, it's still just further out than the phase in which Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and that offshore section of New England is in their development process. Any questions there? Okay, great. Yeah, next slide. So now I'm going to talk about, given what I just said about kind of where Maine is in their development process for offshore wind and how it's a different type of technology for the most part than what southern New England is planning to develop. A lot of what I'm going to share right now are studies that are being done or have been done. So there are going to be a lot of assumptions involved. So, you know, there may be disagreements about whether those were the correct assumptions. And I'll get into a bit more about how they were all developed. So this is just a snapshot of an economic study that the ISO performed at the request of the New England States Committee on Electricity in 2019. So they wanted to look at offshore wind. They wanted to say, okay, if we have different penetration levels by different years, what will that look like for the system in New England in terms of costs, you know, in terms of the market costs, and then in terms of, you know, some high level transmission analysis. So just so you know, NESCO has managers from each of the state, and your manager for Maine is your chairman of the PUC, Phil Bartlett. So he's often well plugged in to these efforts. If you need another resource point other than me, but you're, as I said, you're always welcome to come to me. So, it looked at all these different penetration levels of offshore wind, and it was looking at southern New England. So that picture is quite small, but you can see the areas looked at. They're south of Martha's Vineyard, south of the South Shore of Massachusetts, so in that neck of the woods. And so, there was a key finding based on the expected transmission system in the year 2030. The ISO anticipated that about 5,800 megawatts of offshore wind could be interconnected into the system without major additional 345 kV upgrades. So those type of studies, those economic studies, those can be requested once per year. And it usually, they come through in about March. And so various studies can be performed based on what stakeholders request. And coordinated studies, of course, are always great because then multiple states in the region can kind of get at information that's relevant to their policy goals or other factors. So next slide. So now I'm going to talk about ongoing studies. So there are a lot of studies underway right now looking at the future grid because the New England states, including Maine, have very aggressive policy goals to decarbonize their economies, to switch to 80 or 100% clean electricity. So there's a lot of work going on at the ISO to kind of help enable that transition and to help figure out a way that we can make sure our system stays really reliable as we really switch out resources from fossil fuel based ones to renewable energy. So next slide. Okay, so one of these studies is the Future Grid Reliability Study. And that was requested by an entity called NEPOOL, the New England Power Pool. And they're often a lot of the market participants. So, they're the owners of the power plants, the transmission lines, the folks that buy the electricity to meet consumer demand. And they wanted to look at what the future system will look like, assuming that many of the states' New England's policy goals are met. So Maine is very much a part of this. They spent a long time developing assumptions and various scenarios. So they're comparing some different resource mixes. They're looking at some high-level transmission analyses associated with those resource mixes. And the ISO has presented some initial results, and further results are being presented throughout this fall. Now, the link at the bottom is the link where you can really delve into this study if you'd like in more detail. There are a lot of materials that you can look at, and you can really look into the assumptions and the Maine specific type of metrics. So next slide. Another batch of studies that we're doing we call it the Pathways to the Future Grid. I know a lot of these names sound familiar, but there's also a link there right at the bottom where you can read more about this. So what we're looking at in this pathway study are some new market designs that might help the region meet its decarbonization goals. So we're looking at a net carbon pricing type of market design, where carbon is priced into power pricing in the market. we're looking at a forward clean energy market where there are kind of two markets being run simultaneously, one for kind of the electricity itself and one for the clean energy attributes. And then we're looking at kind of a hybrid of those two designs. So you can see that, a really important underlying assumption is that decrease of 80% below 1990 levels of carbon dioxide by the year 2040. And then we haven't released results on these analyses yet, so we're expecting that in 2022. So next slide, please. And then this is very relevant to you all, I think, and it's actually very timely. It's great that you're meeting today. This is the 2050 transmission study. So we've been working with NESCO once again on this study, and it's a really high level study looking at years that go beyond our traditional planning horizon. So traditionally we look out 10 years when we do our planning studies. Our needs assessments. We do needs assessments for Upper Maine, we do them for Lower Maine, we do them for other states in New England. But the states really wanted to look further out, given that a lot of the goals are for dates further out than 10 years in the future. And so they wanted to look at various scenarios of what will the transmission system kind of need to look like to be able to incorporate the new resources that will be required to meet all of these goals that the states are working to achieve. But importantly, it's not a plan for specific projects. It's a hypothetical study using a lot of real world assumptions, but it's not a plan that's going to come out and say, you need to upgrade, X line between X point here and Y point there, in the way sometimes that our needs assessments do, where we say, okay, this very specific substation will need to be upgraded within 3 years. So it's not that type of study. Next slide. So still on the 2050 transmission study, where it came out of was a vision statement that the New England states all released in 2020 about looking to the future energy system. And so that's where, we are really getting our information from, and how we're working very closely on the design of that study with the states, given that this is very much coming out of what they'd like to see in the future for the power system. All the assumptions are based within that earlier study that I mentioned, the Future Grid Reliability Study. And I'm going to go through a few of those snapshots as they relate to Maine and offshore wind. But there are links in these slides that you can go into more detail, because I'm going to, we don't have a lot of time here, and it's a very technical study. Next slide. Okay, so here's a nice snapshot of the assumptions relating to offshore wind in this 2050 study. So you can see that on the left, they're looking at various years and megawatt amounts for offshore wind, for fixed bottom offshore wind. So the resource type column says fixed, so that means fixed bottom. And then you can see on the right, the resource type is floating. So that's really where a lot of the megawatts for Maine become relevant. You can see in 2035, for example, they're assuming 902 megawatts for floating offshore wind in Maine, and then by 2050 that goes up to 6,900 megawatts. Next slide, please. So we're also looking at some of those key interconnection points of bringing the offshore wind onto the existing system onshore. And, as you can imagine, a lot of that is going to look to the coastal interconnection points. And so there have been a lot of retirements over the years of infrastructure on the coast, whether it be oil, coal, nuclear. So a lot of that will come in useful in terms of having capacity to bring offshore wind onto the shore. And so we looked at some of those types of points in this study. And going to the next slide, we have some visuals for that. So here's for the study year 2035. You can see that in Maine, they're going to look at the Yarmouth interconnection spot for the offshore wind. Then if you go to the next slide. So this is for the 2040 year. See, there are additional points of interconnection that the study is going to model. And then if you go to the next slide in 2050, there are even more points of interconnection. And so these are all assumptions. None of this is a foregone conclusion. And what's great about the timing with this study and all of you is that all of these assumptions are going to be presented this Wednesday at the Planning Advisory Committee. And that Planning Advisory Committee is open to the public. So if you go to the next slide. So before that, I'll give you more details about the Planning Advisory Committee, but just before we go to that, I will cover this first. The study also includes information from past studies. So in Maine, we've done a couple studies called resource integration studies and cluster studies. So when Maine had a lot of onshore wind that it was looking to develop, we said, what's a way where we can do this perhaps more efficiently rather than studying one individual project at a time and creating kind of a long backlog when there are a lot of projects looking to interconnect and get developed in similar areas. So we looked at those kind of in groupings. And so we're taking some of that information from those studies for Maine for this 2050 transmission study. And a really important thing to know about Maine, which I imagine some of you are very familiar with, is that in the ISO New England context and in the regional context, it's considered export constrained. So what that means is there are constraints sometimes in moving power from Maine into the southern parts of New England. So for example, we run a forward capacity market, which is a market that looks out 3 years and says, okay, what resources do we need to have in the system in 3 years to ensure reliability for the entire region? And then we hold an auction and resources compete to get capacity supply obligations so that they can get they can have revenue to be able to operate, to be able to construct, to kind of fill in the gap from the revenues that they might not get in the energy market. And Maine is modeled as a nested region within northern New England because of this export constraint that it sees. So that's a really important thing to consider as you go forward in terms of thinking about developing onshore wind and then how you bring that into Maine, how you use it in Maine, but then how you also, will allow that power to flow into southern New England, where the really big load centers are in New England. So, of course, Massachusetts, Connecticut, they're really where the bulk of demand lies in New England. So they often have to import power, whereas Maine often ends up exporting power because you produce more than you use. So going to the next slide, and I'll circle back to the Planning Advisory Committee and some process here for that 2050 study. It's an open stakeholder forum, as you can see here. They meet once a month. They are meeting this Wednesday. I put the website right in here for you so you can get the details on how you can attend that virtually. And so it's open to the public. The only restriction is that sometimes materials presented that is protected as critical energy infrastructure information. And to view that type of material, you often need to get clearance from us, and you need to get a special certificate, saying you'll protect that data. But fortunately, this study that will be presented in terms of its initial assumptions on Wednesday, that is not CEII material. So you could attend that meeting. I believe it's scheduled for the afternoon portion of the meeting, but the agenda is at that link. And you can really walk through these assumptions in detail with the engineers that developed them. So, I've had a sneak preview of this presentation. It's close to 80 slides. So it's a very technical presentation, but those little preview slides I gave you, that have to do with Maine and offshore wind. They'll be discussed in much more detail. And I think my next slides are just, more information type of slides. Yes, so we have some great publications on our website. We do a regional electricity outlook every year. It's not shown here, but we just came out with our biennial regional system plan. That's on our website. That has some interesting information about each of the states, about offshore wind. And so that's very hot off the presses right now. And then we have great state profiles. So we have a state profile for Maine on our website as well. So you really can get some great high level electricity system information about Maine that might be useful for your some of your working groups or your advisory council here. Next slide. Oh, and then of course there's our famous app, the ISO to go app, and that's just a really nice app to see, look at prices. You can look at Maine specifically. You can look at what resources are generating right now in the moment, and you can get alerts if there's a change in the system status. So with that, that's all I had, and I'm happy to take any questions. I know that was a lot, so feel free to follow up or ask today.
Yeah, thanks, Kate, so much. And we're going to be crushing up against the top of the hour here where we'll lose a bunch of folks. So I wonder if I'm happy if folks want to drop some more things in the chat quickly. A quick question for Kate, if there's something burning on people's minds, if we want to lob that question right now, and happy to also to coordinate questions on the back end over email, and we can get some responses. But if there's something that, Dan, do you want to make a quick question?
Yeah, I would just say that thank you, Kate, for taking the time. We work closely with Kate and the team at ISO on a number of initiatives and just information sharing. So I think we're happy to also serve with David and others as the conduit for questions or updates as we go forward, but really informative.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Dan.
And I know that some of the working groups have specific questions about the implications for transmission structures for offshore wind, right? And so there are specific questions that the working groups are wrestling with that probably will come your way, Kate, to think about how to tap into ISO New England's thinking around transmission for offshore wind. Okay, great. All right, so it's a minute before the top of the hour. We don't have a lot that we wanted to say about our next meeting. Thanks again, Kate. Really appreciate you coming and giving that background for today. On December 14th, we're going to tee up a really robust discussion on initial recommendations that are ready to share with you. Some groups may feel less enthusiastic about sharing on December 14th. Other working groups are going to be ready to share a bunch of recommendations. We're going to have a conversation. Initially, we thought we might do it in person at Maine. We're going to save that for January for a number of reasons. So we're going to do this again on Zoom for December 14th. But we are planning an in-person gathering in our late January meeting up at Maine. And so we can see each other in person, have some conversations. We can, for those who want to, can also do a tour of the Maine facilities around this. Habib has been very generous to offer that. I don't have a lot more to say, except we're going to be giving some thoughts to you all as an advisory committee about how to listen to what's coming in from the working groups and how to think about the criteria you want to use to be reacting to these ideas coming in. Top of the hour, Grog or Dan, anything else you want to say before we sign off today? Grog, go ahead, please.
I'd just like to echo what Dan said about the presentation we just had, Kate. That was extremely helpful, and you've given us enough links that will keep us busy for months trying to dig into it all. But I think there's some overarching messages that we got from that that'll significantly inform all of our working groups, and certainly the final recommendations from the advisory group. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Excellent. Anything else, Dan?
No, thanks everybody. Have a great rest of the day.
Have a great Monday, everybody. Take care. Have a good week. We'll see you on December 14th. All the best.